Within video games, a common thematic through line of many texts is that of endless self-improvement, texts often designed specifically to incentivize the development of skill with the game and that particular player, largely stemming from the fact that the medium is, at its core, games, and play itself often constitutes some form of skill. This is most commonly expressed today through the genre spaces of fighting and action games, both requiring rigorous understandings of their systems to often achieve the highest understandings of their texts. Both have their roots in the arcade design philosophy of rigorous replay and internalization, but with the advent of more elaborately involved scenarios, this drive for skill and self-expression becomes more of an explicit forefront than something implicitly understood, and that change is something that specifically interested Capcom. It's easy to see a through line between their oeuvre. While never not focused on skill and improvement, there's definitely a marked difference between the way the challenges of Mega Man are textually framed, obstacles to be overcome as a formality of saving the day, as compared to Street Fighter's Ryu, who relishes in challenge and actively seeks further and further heights to better improve himself as a fighter, ludicrously represented by the endless skill ceilings of that particular series. Resident Evil, arguably Capcom's most known series of works, hinges on these trappings as well in spite of its home console format and increased focus on cinematic influences. Each playthrough is graded, the player given a means to develop further beyond what they've done already. This fixation on skill-based play eventually gave birth to Devil May Cry, which itself marries its skill incentivization and player expression to the narrative through main character Dante's fixation on stylish performance and his connection to the style meter, which grades all the actions that the player takes. While the protagony of Resident Evil, such as Jill Valentine and Leon Kennedy's journeys through their particular spaces, may be graded by the end, that is by mere serendipity, whereas Dante feels almost in tune with the rebellious spirit of developing style and combos, flowing between movements effortlessly in cutscenes as he does in high-level gameplay. The game's sequel, Devil May Cry 2, however, presents an interesting twist on this idea. It's much more lethargic and jaded, an experience that feels devoid of life. Devil May Cry 2 subverts the fetishization of skill-based play in games to invoke that this pursuit of individualist self-improvement is intrinsically tied to their intense and cutting violence through the two protagonists' listless mental states as reflective of the empty systems that the game is built around, the aimless and near-pointless existence of the enemies that roam its spaces, and those spaces themselves being wide and open as dead husks of what was a gothic world oozing with emotion. Devil May Cry 2 differs from its predecessor in a pretty substantial way in that there are two major protagonists and points of view through which the narrative is untangled. Dante returns from the first game a changed man from his experiences in that text Mallet Island, and he is joined by a new character by the name of Lucia. Both are individuals lost in their lives, Dante mired in grief and survivor's guilt after killing his older brother during the events of the original Devil May Cry, and Lucia trapped in a crisis of identity after learning that she herself is not human, but a doll constructed for the purposes of the game's primary antagonist, Arius. This depressed period of their lives brings them together at the game's onset, and both of them wander almost lifelessly and purposelessly through the game's events as a result of their dispositions. Their journeys don't have a particularly coherent through line from a plot perspective. They are both in conflict with Arius, but there's not much reason why and not much plan for how to resolve that conflict. Events occur and they react, and that existence is reflective of their mutual depressions. By the end of the work, both come to resolution. Dante finds his characteristic banter again after confronting his sin-given life, and Lucia kills Arius and becomes herself. It's important to note then that these moments of narrative peace for the two characters are not ludic ones. Deliberately, control is taken away from the player. Their suffering can only be resolved when the player is not in control of them, not commanding the ways they move through spaces, not seeking ever higher and higher combos for their own satisfaction. Only then can they be at peace and at home with themselves. An interesting comparison to the other work's emphasis on constantly chasing higher and higher levels of player expression. Dante and Lucia are not the only entities that inhabit the spaces of Devil May Cry 2, however, and in turn they are not the only ones that are devoid of aspiration. The enemies that roam the spaces of Devil May Cry 2 do so seemingly without any inclination of attacking the player, often utterly ignoring them in favor of aimlessly wandering around the area. They may look in Dante's direction, but they will almost never prioritize attacking him. This sickness that consumes the main characters so too consumes the rest of the artifice. As compared to Devil May Cry, where monsters are very proactive and difficult to deal with, the enemies of Devil May Cry 2 are ones that can be safely ignored in large part. They have no drive left to them, like Dante and and Lucia, ephemeral ghosts of the action game Viscera conscripted to be there by the forces of the genre space. There is no purpose to most of the game's violence, only an endless empty submission to its demands. While bosses confront Dante and Lucia directly, many still are ludically listless in much the same way. The infested chopper, for example, hides from the player out of frame, though notably not Dante. The violence of Devil May Cry 2 is entirely pointless and only motivated by the player self's desire to turn the game into a vehicle for it. The spaces that the player pilots the protagonist through in Devil May Cry 2, while understated, are one of the most important pieces of this puzzle. They're empty and decrepit, especially in contrast to the tight gothic spaces of Mallet Island. While that game's map is interconnected, each area weaving into the next in a near seamless understanding of the game world, Devil May Cry 2's world is not so prelapsarian. The world is atomized and stratified, cut up into several pieces, and within those pieces are barren towns devoid of the life that should be populating it, urban structures completely empty where bustling interconnection might be, and office buildings without any of their staff. Devil May Cry 2 is an isolated game, and its extremely open and aimless level design is a massive complement to that. Shots often framing Dante or Lucia is very small in comparison to the landscape surrounding them, and therefore the atomizing reckoning of post-modernity itself. Much like everything else about the ludic elements of Devil May Cry 2 compared to its predecessor, there is no recourse to be found in the stage dressing of the violence, only further emptiness that the violence itself perpetuates. Devil May Cry 2 as a response to Devil May Cry is one of the most interesting sequels in video games due to how it totally subverts the mechanics of the original text it is in response to. While that game is one that focuses so much on self-expression and the further buildup of player skill through violence, much like so many games, especially ones in Capcom's oeuvre, Devil May Cry 2 interrogates that desire entirely. This is expressed through the narrative ennui of both Dante and Lucia as compared to the pointed righteous violence of Dante in the first game, the listless realities of the enemies that typically would chase after or seek to harm a player in any game, and the void spaces that the player inhabits while traveling through the game world. Devil May Cry 2 uses the strengths of the medium to their fullest to convey a narrative that no other game has really tackled in similar ways. A ludic narrative about depression without that depression ever being openly vocalized, only ever expressed in swinging a heavy sword against unwilling combatants in a dead world. This has been Arcade Everlasting, who thinks 2 is the best Devil May Cry game, signing off. Thank you for watching.